Hello there. A suicide car bombing in the Somali capital has killed 4 civilians, but it's also added a new deadly dimension to the conflict there. A second car bomber had earlier targeted Ethiopian soldiers, detonating his vehicle packed with explosives as a military truck passed by. 1 Somali government soldier was injured. It's all adding to the carnage that's left hundreds dead as Mogadishu faces its 7th day of street battles. Here's our correspondent Mohammed Ado.
Heavy shelling and tank fire continues to rock Somalia's capital for a 7th day. The fighting has plunged the country into deeper chaos, with at least 250 people, mostly civilians, killed in the last week. Clan militias and Islamic court fighters are battling pro-government Ethiopian troops in the southern part of Mogadishu. They are pounding each other with machine gun fire, mortars, tank shells and heavy artillery. The city's hospitals are overflowing. Some of the injured receive treatment as they lie on the concrete floors. Others have to sleep under trees. The few medical personnel still there have barely enough supplies to patch up the wounded.
Up to 670 injured persons have been brought here since the fighting began. They don't get enough attention. We're only 2 doctors here. Other staff could not report for duties due to the fighting. The hospital also has been a target of the shelling. We had 2 mortars landing in one of the hospital's buildings.
However, if the government's word is anything to go by, Mogadishu's residents have not seen the last of the violence in their city. The interim government says it will aggressively pursue its opponents and has called on local residents to flee the city.
The government troops have confiscated 700 kilograms of explosives and a surface-to-air missile.
As the fighting intensifies, thousands of people have fled the city. Many live outdoors on the outskirts of the city, while others have fled deeper into the countryside. Many will die there, say aid officials, with food and medicine in short supply. Local people blame outsiders.
I tell the international community to rescue us from the Ethiopians who are shelling our country, massacring our people. They are invaders. We are a Muslim country, and I am appealing to Muslim countries to give us support.
The violence has now spread beyond Mogadishu. Fierce fighting on Monday in the southern port city of Ismail has left many wondering whether the conflict will once more engulf the whole country.
So that was Mohammed Ado there. We spoke to him earlier about this new tactic of suicide bombing in Mogadishu.
This is a very new scenario to the conflict in Somalia. One of the attacks today was a car bomb, and it targeted an Ethiopian army base outside Mogadishu. A total of 6 Ethiopian and Somali government officials are said to have died in that attack. In the second one, it was said to be a roadside bomb which targeted some Ethiopian troops and some Somali soldiers who were with them. It killed also about another 7 people and injured scores others. This is a very new scenario to the conflict, and it just shows how desperate and unconventional it is becoming by the day. The Islamic Courts Union, which still has its remnants of fighting the Ethiopian forces, says that it has been responsible for both attacks.
Now, all this ongoing violence has Somalis facing their worst humanitarian crisis in over 20 years. And it's reported that urgently needed aid is being held up while the Somali government demands to inspect all food and medical deliveries. Well, earlier, Pedram Yazdi from the International Red Cross in Somalia talked about how aid workers are coping with the crisis.
The International Committee of the Red Cross is supporting the medical facilities in Mogadishu. We have just sent 11 tons of medical supplies to the medical facilities in Mogadishu. I was just a few hours ago, I was with the director of the Medina hospitals, and he was saying that, of course, it's very difficult for them to work because they are working 24 hours a day. but they have enough supply. They are arranging place for the wounded. I should underline that tens of wounded are arriving every day to medical facilities, mainly to Medina and Kaysania hospitals. I should highlight also that there is a cholera program in Mogadishu, and the Somali Red Crescent Society has opened also centers to provide assistance to the population.
And one final note out of Africa, 74 oil workers have been killed in eastern Ethiopia in an attack on a Chinese-run oil field. Now, a rebel group has taken responsibility for the attack. Up to 200 gunmen were involved, killing 65 Ethiopian employees and 9 Chinese. Another 7 Chinese workers are also reported to have been kidnapped. US President George Bush has criticised new legislation put forward for emergency war funding in Iraq. The legislation calls for the withdrawal of troops from Iraq, and President Bush says he will veto it.
Yesterday, Democratic leaders announced that they plan to send me a bill that will fund our troops only if we agree to handcuff our generals, add billions of dollars in unrelated spending, and begin to pull out of Iraq by an arbitrary date. I'm disappointed that the Democratic leadership has chosen this course. The bill they announced yesterday includes some of the worst parts of the measures they had earlier passed with narrow majorities in the House and the Senate. They know I'm going to veto a bill containing these provisions, and they know that my veto will be sustained.
Meanwhile, in Iraq, a suicide truck bomb has killed 25 people in the city of Ramadi. Meanwhile, an Al-Qaeda-linked group has reportedly claimed responsibility for an earlier attack which killed 9 US soldiers. They died when a suicide car bomber hit a US military outpost in Diyala province on Monday. The so-called Islamic State of Iraq, an umbrella of armed groups, including Al-Qaeda, said in a web statement that it carried out the attack. Meanwhile, 2 car bombs have exploded within minutes of each other near the Iranian embassy in Baghdad. 6 people were wounded. For 5 months, there was a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians, a ceasefire plainly broken on Tuesday by 61 mortars and nearly 30 rockets fired into Israel. They came from the armed wing of Hamas, which now says the truce, quote, no longer exists. Now, the Palestinian Unity government is calling for the ceasefire to be honoured, but as our Gaza correspondent Noorode says, there's now a growing fear among Palestinians of a new Israeli army crackdown.
What Prime Minister Haniya said and what Mr. Ghazi Hamad repeated is that Israel is responsible for any escalation, for any infraction of that ceasefire. But it would be very difficult for any political leader to ignore what the spokespersons of basically all the military wings of the Palestinian factions have said today, which is in response to the Israeli actions, these factions don't consider that a ceasefire is still in place.
So what is the likely response that we can expect from the military armed wing of Hamas to this kind of plea?
Well, at this point, the military wing of Hamas, the Kataib Izzuddin al-Qassam, have been firm on their position, which the spokesperson had conveyed to me in a phone conversation, which is there is no ceasefire. And that split, that schism between the political position and that of the military wings is something we've seen in the past in the Palestinian political arena. We haven't seen it so much within the Hamas movement, which is usually having a more cohesive political and military position. We had seen it in the past with Fatah putting many Fatah officials on the spot in cases like this. But at the moment, I think it would be difficult for these two positions to reconcile.
And the breaking of the ceasefire makes things even more difficult for the Palestinian president, who's currently trying to shore up financial support in Europe. Even so, when Mahmoud Abbas met with Pope Benedict at the Vatican, the pair were hailing recent moves to revive the Middle East peace process. President Abbas and the pontiff met just hours after the Hamas attack. They're said to have discussed the situation in the Palestinian territories during their brief meeting. In Sri Lanka, Tamil Tiger fighters say they've carried out an air raid on a government military airbase in the north of the country. 6 soldiers were killed. It's the second rebel airstrike since the Tigers started their 24-year-long war for a Tamil homeland. Last month, a plane bombed a Sri Lankan Air Force base outside the capital, Colombo, which killed 3 airmen.